David, you can start when you're ready.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the IECS seminar series. So for those of you who haven't been here before, IECS stands for the Institute for Applied Computational Science, and in the spring and fall semester we offer a seminar series where we invite researchers from academia and industry to talk about some of the cutting edge work that's going on in the realms of computational and data science. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to let everyone know, just looking ahead, that next week this topic is the speaker is going to be Jessica Stoth from Fidelity Labs, and she's going to talk about, the title of the talk is Start With Why. It's not just good leadership advice, it's good data science practice. So in case you're interested in next week, that's the topic. Today's speaker is Cengiz Pehlivan. He's an assistant professor in applied mathematics at Harvard. Before that, he was a research scientist at the Flatiron Institute, and his research topics are in the realm of computational neuroscience, some deep learning, neural net stuff, and he's going to talk today about a function approximation view on neural representations. So welcome, Cengiz. You can take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks for this invitation. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Okay, so just before I start, let me start by thanking the people who actually did the work here. These are two graduate students at Harvard, Blake and Abdul, and the content, most of the content of my talk is already available either in these two papers. One is already published, the other one is in review, and so it does have some aspect that is more like deep learning like, and then more neuroscience like. And if you want to hear more about those aspects, there will be presentations coming in the next 2 weeks into 2 different conferences more about this work. Now, the title of these papers might seem orthogonal to my talk title, but they're not, and I hope I will be able to make that connection. And especially, I mean, kernel regression and kernel methods are going to be at the heart of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so so I will try to motivate this idea of function approximation through a deep learning story, and then later on, and I will try to give applications of all of that theory to neuroscience too. And in the audience, I see some people who were present at a talk I recently gave at the Center for Brain Science. Just to give them a warning, a lot of the things I will be saying will be a repeat, maybe a bit more technical, and towards the end there will be some new stuff too. Okay, so what function and what approximation I'm talking about here? So let's think of basically, so I'm thinking of a supervised learning problem, and I'm given some samples, let's say X, and these, and I want, so these X's go through a function Y of X, and I want to, let's say, fit this function X of Y. So let's think of the simplest example of this, a scalar, let's say, function. It takes an X to a scalar Y, and I'm given just 2 examples from this, right? So, so this is a data set, and training, let's say, a neural network on this data set is basically equivalent to fitting this function or approximating this function. And so there are interesting properties of neural systems when they do such kind of learning and function approximation. So here is one, and this will be the content of what I'll try to explain today. So here is a 2 hidden layer neural network with 100 neurons in each layer. It's fully connected, so it has about 10,000 parameters. And I'm going to, throw the full, let's say, power of deep learning with its optimizers and everything in this data set. It's just 2 points, okay? Just the simplest thing. And what is it going to do? It turns out this network obviously fits these 2 points extremely well, and beyond these points, it's going to make some predictions. And you might, so when I started working on this, I was a bit naive about how these things work. And I was imagining, oh, this is a machine with so many units and so many parameters, it can fit any crazy looking function to these 2 points. So presumably after training, I'll get something, very, I don't know, complex. But it turns out, I mean, you can do this with TensorFlow or whatever your particular favorite tool is. The network's prediction or approximation to this function from which you just get 2 examples pretty much looks like a line. So it's a very simple thing. Now that is interesting because it does basically seem to say something like an Occam's razor principle is going on in this process, that the out of all the possible fits that this network could able to do into these 2D points, is choosing something simple. In other words, neural networks are strongly biased towards simple functions, and this talk will be about what strongly means and what simple means, actually. Okay, and even more curiously, you can just keep increasing the width of these neural networks, basically add more and more neurons. Okay, so this is basically what that, and then repeat this procedure. And the kinds of fits that you get more and more, let's say, simpler, right? So the series with 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and basically the network's prediction or fits are getting basically, more and more, straight line looking. And the number of parameters are getting like crazy large here. So basically we're fitting about 1 million parameters for this blue line. Okay, so my goal here is to basically exactly understand what this phenomenon is. Why are the neural networks choosing these simple functions over other ones, and what does neural representations have to do with this? Okay, and this particular sort of phenomenon is really relevant to understanding what's happening in modern deep neural networks. Because, I mean, a lot of them are trained in this so-called over-parameterized regime. You are having many more parameters than the number of data points. So these are some like famous models for trained on, usually on object recognition or image recognition data sets. I mean, you get millions and millions of parameters. Traditionally, I mean, image data sets have about, like the ImageNet has about 1 million parameters. So you have a lot more parameters than, ImageNet has about 1 million data points, parameters. And these numbers have reached 1 million, like not 1 million, to levels of hundreds of billions of parameters. That's the state of the art in this kind of over-parameterization. So with that intro, here are the kinds of questions that I want to answer, okay? So what are the kinds of biases, I mean, the inductive biases or the preference towards what kind of functions do over-parameterized neural networks have? What makes a function easy or hard to approximate, okay? And by that, I mean, how many samples do you need to get a good approximation? And I want to also, of course, build a theory for these things, and then discuss the implications of that theory for artificial and biological neural systems. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So let's take a step back and like introduce some mathematical formalism to address these questions. Okay, so of course, point one is that these neural networks are parameterized functions. Okay, so that's just an obvious point. Just for some notation, I will denote the parameters of a neural network all by this vector theta. This includes all the weights and biases and other, okay. And I'll have n be the number of parameters and p be the number of training points or examples that I'm going to present. So n is going to be larger than p. So let's just imagine what's going on in a typical training scenario. And I will try to demonstrate by a picture. So let this sort of slide be some representation of the n-dimensional parameter space. What that means is each point on this space basically defines an input-output function. Right? So if you go to our previous figure, if I choose that, change that theta, basically I get a different x to f of x mapping. All right? So when I initialize my network, I choose a theta 0. So that's where I am. This is the kind of function that I have. And so I have p examples, I have n parameters, and n is larger than p. And this neural network, unless it is really except special cases, it will be able to fit this data perfectly. And we can describe this sort of n minus p dimensional solution space, right? By basically let's say a manifold on this low dimensional manifold on this space. So I'm being sketchy here, but that's for the purpose. Okay, so you're here, and these are all the points in this parameter space that would exactly fit your data points. And basically, you start your training procedure. That training procedure takes you from here to a point on that solution space, right? So that's basically it. And so which point you choose in that solution space depends on many things, right? For example, the particular learning algorithm that takes you from here to there, the particular loss function that takes you from here to there, and so on and so forth. And also, so you suppose you end up at this point, the properties of that point, whether it's a, why that point is a simple function as opposed to a more complex function, depends on probably the properties of this function space. So I'm using the word inductive bias here. So that basically refers to the bias of the neural network towards certain functions other than the other ones. And this is going to be given by, just loosely speaking, the properties of this function space, the loss function, and the learning algorithm. And it's found why this function space is, of course, depends on the neural network's architecture. Its activations, and so on and so forth, all these properties. Okay, so basically, we need to put all of this, take in account all of this if you want to understand this phenomenon. And obviously, this is a hard problem, right? This requires, it's a complex system. How do we even deal with such kind of a problem? But there are some simplifying and relevant limits of deep networks that might help you actually come up with answers to these questions. And that's the thing that we're going to do. So I'm going to go after some kind of an analytical treatment. So therefore, I'm going to look for a simplifying limit that might help me to do this analysis. And in particular, so is there a relevant simplification? Relevant in the sense that, it captures this idea of over-parameterization and the idea that these particular properties that I'm talking about. Okay. In particular, there has been a lot of work in this particular limit of neural networks. This is the infinite width limit. And I think 2 weeks ago, Yasemen Bahri gave an amazing talk about all the theory that's beyond this development. So hopefully you were there. But the idea is the following. So if you take a limit where each of the number of neurons in a particular layer gets large and large and large, so that's what we mean by width, okay? And also, there's another ingredient in the story. You are initializing your neural networks randomly, and in particular, that randomness is a Gaussian distribution with a particular variance. Okay? So something magical happens. Basically, the whole complexity and the training dynamics of these neural networks simplify. Okay, and I want to point that this is relevant to the over-parameterization limit we're talking about because if you have many neurons and you basically the number of parameters here go by their squared, so you have many more parameters. So that's the idea. And the particular simplification is the following. So here's a paper from folks at Google. So what they were looking was the following, and I think Yasemen talked about this in more detail. So what's being plotted here on the y-axis is basically some normalized change in weight. So these thetas are again the parameters. So think of this theta as a vector here. It's a vector of all the parameters in the network. So capital T stands for trained, 0 stands for initial. So basically you're comparing your final weights to initial weights and you're normalizing them by the initial weight. So F is for the Frobenius norm here. Okay, and then and on the x-axis, you're plotting the width of these neural networks. So basically, how many neurons do you have per layer? So these are feed-forward, fully connected neural network. That's what we're talking about here. And this normalized weight, as you see, basically keeps normalized change in weight. I apologize. Keeps decreasing and decreasing and decreasing, and these asymptotics can be described by 1 over n or 1 over root n. The point being, in the limit of infinite width, basically the changes in the weights are really small. Okay, so what that does, of course, gives us a simplification because it does mean that when we start with this complex neural network, we train it. Trained solution is not so far away from our initial point, and that we can use heuristically to define a simplification or like a approximation. Now I'm going to just give you a simple sort of a way to justify this, but I mean, all these arguments that I'm making can be made more rigorous, and that they have been discussed in these few papers. But suppose we were training this neural network with squared loss. Basically, here is the output of my neural network. Suppose I have p samples. I label them with this Greek index mu. So for each sample I have, this is what my neural network produces. And y mu is the true output that I want to match. And I have an extra parenthesis here, sorry. That's the square root of it. So that's my loss. So if my network is not going to, my trained weights are not far away from my initial weights, I could imagine linearizing or just doing a first order Taylor expansion around my initial point. And I could describe the function that my neural network is approximating at some theta, by this expansion around my initial conditions. I just want to make the point that what is being linearized here is the dependence on theta. I mean, the dependence on x is still very nonlinear, right? These are all nonlinear functions of x. These are still nonlinear networks. I'm not talking about a linear network, but I'm talking about, okay, sorry, a linearization in the function on this theta space. So I'm sorry, I missed some questions in the chat, but people answered them on my behalf. Thank you very much. And also please feel free to just jump in and stop me. So it's really hard for me to monitor chat and at the same time focus on my talk. Okay. All right, so if you plug this back in here and basically then I'm not gonna write equations, but just basically do a gradient descent or gradient flow minimization all the way to zero error, you can actually write down an analytical solution to this. And an analytical solution looks like this, okay? So I just want to make a few points here. So what this solution sort of entails, what it includes. So it does include, so first of all, this is a solution not just for the training points, it's a solution for any point. So it does also tell you what this neural network predicts beyond the training points. It does include the training examples. This y is basically the output of the desired outputs all made into a vector. And there is this object called sort of neural tangent kernel. So this is going to be an important object in our discussion, which is given by the dot product of the network's outputs, okay, basically with itself. So the gradients of the network's outputs with itself evaluated at 2 different points. Now, the particular version that goes into here is evaluated on the data points. Okay, so that's what that is. And the third ingredient, well, this is again the NTK, but this time one of these indices is evaluated at the data points, and that's the one that gets multiplied by the k inverse. And the other one is basically a generic point for which you might be making the prediction. Okay, so basically the main ingredient here is this object. Okay. And the other thing I want to point about this object is, I mean, this is theta 0 initial condition. So that was sort of the big contributions of these authors, that they were saying, well, I mean, actually, you do not need to calculate this for the trained network. If you calculate it for the initialization, that is sufficient to describe what's going to happen after training. Okay. So this is a formula. Okay, so I'm displaying this formula because I want to make a connection to another problem and another formula that I'm going to get out from that problem, and that's going to come next. So this is going to come later again. Again, the main thing to take here is this object called neural tangent kernel. It's neural because this is a neural network. It's tangent because I'm taking a gradient. It's tangent to this neural network's, the tangent space to this neural network's output, and kernel, and that's what's going to come next. Okay. So now I want to take basically 5 minutes and discuss a completely different problem. It's the problem of kernel regression. Okay, what do I mean by kernel regression? So it's the following problem. It's again it's a regression problem. Okay, and the idea is now we're trying to learn a function. Okay, from a finite number of observations from that function, and this function comes up with particular properties. In particular, it's a member of a certain kind of Hilbert space. It's called the reproducing kernel Hilbert space. So if you don't know what that is, that's not very important at that moment. Okay, and that Hilbert space has an inner product associated with it. But the main sort of problem we are trying to solve is exactly, we're giving a training set, a bunch of examples from this function, let's say a P of them, okay? And these X's might be living in some D-dimensional space. And then our goal is to basically find a function within that space that approximates sort of those data points as well as possible. Also, we might also introduce some regularizer here. So this is very much like a typical regularized regression, and so on and so forth. Okay, the only difference is this H here denotes a particular kind of regularizer. Okay, and what you can do is you can actually give an analytical solution to this, and that analytical solution exactly looks like this. Okay, so this is very similar to the previous equation that I wrote, and I'll come back to that conclusion again. So it has exactly the output vector here, an object called kernel here. So this K corresponds to an object called the reproducing kernel for this Hilbert space. So roughly speaking, it's an analog of basically a Green's function for this space, for this Hilbert space, if you know what that is. But if not, I will make that a bit more precise in the coming slides. And the lambda equal to 0 limit. So here, basically, this is a parameter that weighs how much you're relying on fitting the data points versus this other term here, which you might now interpret as a regularization. The lambda equal to 0 limit says, I'm only fitting those data points. So that limit is also called kernel interpolation. Okay. All right. So basically, just to put everything together, I'm trying to do regression. But the point is, I'm looking for functions that live in a particular Hilbert space that has some properties. Okay, so why am I saying this? So here are the two formulas, kernel regression and infinite width neural networks. So they look exactly identical. So the infinite width neural network trained with gradient flow, okay, is making these predictions on my data set. And this is what the kernel regression would make. So therefore, what we're going to do is, to understand this, we're going to make a theory of this. The particular techniques I use come from statistical mechanics, so from physics. And then, there's this extra parameter here, which I can always take to 0, no problem, and get insight into trained neural networks. So all I need to do is solve this side, replace this K by KNTK, and take lambda to 0. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So, and that is the content of the two papers I cited in the beginning of the talk, basically how to solve this problem and how to come up with a statistical mechanical understanding of it. And that theory has a few ingredients. So let me introduce what these ingredients are, and then we're going to give you the result of the theory. So here's one ingredient, and this is where I make the connection of this object kernel and the function space. Okay, so the kernel basically induces a basis in this function space, which is this reproducing kernel Hilbert space. Okay, and that goes through an eigenvalue problem. Okay, sorry about that. So this is basically, well, I said an eigenvalue problem, yes, and a continuous version of it, an eigenfunction problem. So here's our data distribution. So our data might be coming from, or we sampled IID from our continuous distribution. Okay, so that gets basically, that integrates one of the arguments of this object, the kernel, and that gets multiplied by this eigenfunction, and out comes basically this eigenvalue equation. Okay, so these eigenfunctions can be countably infinite or can be finite. And this particular set of functions are called Mercer functions. Okay. The important point about this is basically these functions constitute a basis, okay, for the functions that I'm trying to do regression in. And in particular, what that means is if I were to solve this problem for neural tangent kernel, NTK here, okay, so these functions would be a basis for all the functions that this neural network could fit or represent in the limit of infinite width. Okay, so that I can basically describe by this equation here. So remember, this neural network's output was a function. So I'm writing here as a scalar here. Okay, just let's think of a scalar function, and that can be basically written as a sum of these functions multiplied by some weights. And of course, all these weights are going to be functions themselves, functions of these networks architecture and synaptic weights and so on and so forth. So this W or theta, sorry, is basically showing me that. So these scalar weights are a function of networks, architecture, and these are basically these eigenfunctions. Okay, and of course, I can do the same kind of expansion for the function that I want to approximate. Okay, so there are some real weights here in that basis, and there are some weights that my neural network produces. And obviously, what I'm going to do now is basically turn this whole problem of network training into basically training these weights and matching them if I can, and how well I can match them. But before I go there, let me give you examples of such eigenfunctions, like for real neural networks. What do they look like? So of course, to be able to do that, I have to specify a few things, right? I have to specify this data distribution, so where this data comes from, and then solve all of this. Obviously, solving this may not be analytically possible. You might need to numerically solve them, and we will do that in a second. But there are some certain cases where you can analytically solve them too. So this is, what a physicist does first. You assume that data lives on some kind of a sphere and it's uniformly distributed. And it turns out in that particular case, you can find these eigenfunctions, and they turn out to be, very reasonable. They turn out to be spherical harmonics. So spherical harmonics are, if you don't know, you can think of that as some kind of generalizations of sines and cosines to high-dimensional spaces. So here is an example of that, of those guys in a two-dimensional space. A three-dimensional space. Excuse me. So the data is living on a two-dimensional space. And the color code here refers to the value of that particular of that function. So the spherical harmonics have two indices. One is called the degree, one is called an order, and the first index and the second index are plotted here. And basically, as you see, k is increasing, gives you sort of more and more complex looking functions. And you can calculate the eigenvalues too through some kind of numerical methods. And these are basically the eigenvalue spectrum of some deep networks as a function of their depth. So as depth gets higher and higher, actually the spectrum gets more and more flat, whiter and whiter. And so that will have some implications later, but I'm just showing you that actually there are some cases we can solve this analytically, and a lot of the times you have to solve it numerically. Okay, so these are the two ingredients, eigenvalues and eigenfunctions, okay? And basically, here's just another way of saying everything I've said, okay? There are 2 points of view of looking at a neural network. One is this traditional point of view, X goes in and some function out of all of this procedure comes out a function. And here's another point of view, which does not rely on anything here. It's a total different point of view in the infinite width limit. I calculate these eigenfunctions. I take these x's, pass them through those eigenfunctions, and then approximate my output by linearly combining them. Okay, so nothing here corresponds to anything simple here. These are just complicated. These are formed by some complicated procedure. Okay, but we can understand this guy analytically, and this guy is sort of hard to understand analytically. Okay, cool. Okay, so here is one technical slide. So here is the so with these ingredients ready, here is the exact problem we solved. Okay, so given some examples, right? So x1 to xp, so we have p examples, and we assume that these examples are coming from some kind of a target function. So this target function might seem limiting. It's not. It can be any function as long as I can write it as in this kind of basis that I'm talking about. I'm going to sample p samples, and then I'm going to do my network fitting procedure, all with the gradient flow all the way to zero training error, which is equivalent to kernel regression. And with that fit, so that's going to be f star over here. I might also add some noise at the end. Okay, I'll keep that for a second. And then I'm going to calculate the difference or the error between not just the training points, but all the predictions or all data points that I could have sampled, okay, between what my fit was and what the network's sort of target sort of function was, okay. So I'll call this the generalization error. And generalization error because I'm looking at all data set, not just the P examples here. And there's an average here. The particular quantity we are calculating is also averaged over all possible data sets. I'll comment on this in a second, okay. It turns out you can take this problem and turn it into a statistical mechanics problem, which I will not bore you with. And you do a lot of calculations, and then you end up with basically some formula, okay. The particular formula is not important. I'm showing it just because there's a formula, but also I just want to point you what it involves. So the formula is a formula for generalization error. So there are some quantities here which you need to self-consistently solve, not very important, but it does depend on these eigenvalues. It does depend on the eigenvalues of the kernel on this particular data set. And basically everything about the network is in these eigenvalues, okay? So that's the one point I want to make. The second thing is basically this P is the number of samples. Okay, so that's also a part of the formula. I want to emphasize that this is valid for any data distribution and any kernel. So even though I started this with NTK neural tangent kernel neural networks, the formula is valid for any kernel. You have to diagonalize the kernel and within that particular data set and so on and so forth. And I'll show you examples of this applying to real data in a second. So this question about I'm averaging over all possible data sets, how does this formula work for a single data set? If the data set is large, yes, okay. This word self-averaging might mean something to the physicists in the audience, but yes. And these equations show actually very rich phenomenology, which does explain some behavior of neural networks. And I'll just mention a few in this talk. For more details, you can please take a look at the papers. But first, let me show you this actually works in data sets, okay, real data sets. And this works for all kernels and data sets we tested, okay? So we tested this on MNIST, Fashion, MNIST, CIFAR10 with all these kinds of other kernels too, okay? So what you're being shown here are simulations versus theory. The solid lines are theory. This is, we take the kernel, numerically diagonalize it, plug it into our formula, the eigenvalues, and we come up with a curve. That's what this curve is. And these dots are basically the numerical simulation. So how much we give this kernel machine, or if it's NTK on the right-hand side, we're actually talking about the neural network. This data set, make it fit, and then calculate the generalization error. And basically, it's really amazing that, like, this theory works so well. I mean, yeah. So the point here is dots sit on top of lines. And there's some error bars over here. The error bars are basically this the dependence on different data sets. So of course, there's a variance between the particular data set to data set. So that's the variance that you're going to get looking at our theory. Depending on your goal, this might be small or large. Okay, but at least on average, it does work very well. Okay, so this gives us some confidence to look at our equations in more deeply and try to understand, say things about these questions I was asking about, like simple functions and complex functions and so on and so forth. Okay. All right, so point one, it works. So now we can look at these equations and take various limits and so on and so forth and try to understand if we can extract more phenomena. So in particular, let's try to understand this bias towards simple functions. Remember, I started with fitting a line to 2 points. Where does that come about? Okay. So there's a formal result in the paper, which I'm not going to go into, but the idea, so you can look at these equations and see the following. So this one is for the analytically solvable model, meaning we're again looking at data coming on a sphere, and then we're trying to fit basically that kind of data. So we can construct multiple target functions. This is illustrated here, okay, with particular spherical harmonic content. In particular, we're going to fix the k here. So we're going to choose a particular k, and we're going to basically construct functions out of some choice of linear combinations of fixed k but different m's. Okay, so this is what this k refers to. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing basically a plot which plots the generalization error, okay, for these different functions. So k refers to, so different k's here different refers to functions with different k content, okay. And so this particular one is a kernel regression, but I'll show you in a second the neural network versions of these two. And so this is the generalization, and here the number of samples, okay. And this is d is equal to 15. It's a 15-dimensional data set. So 15-dimensional sphere we're looking at. So the generalization error for the first guy basically starts falling after 15 samples. Remember, this just contains k is equal to 1 kind of functions. The generalization error for the second function, which includes just k is equal to 2 functions, start falling around here, and the third here, and the fourth guy around here, and so on and so forth, okay? So what we observe is the following. It takes about d times more examples to start learning the next k mode. Let me say that again. For the first d samples, this network tries to explain the data with basically using just the first k equal to 1 modes of the spherical harmonics. And then for the next set of examples, for the from d to d squared examples, it's now starts fitting the next modes in this spherical harmonic expansion, and so on and so forth. And to an extent that, so if your function was only composed of k equal to 7 modes, so pretty complex sort of looking spherical harmonics over here, right? So by the time you have seen 10 to the 4 examples, it would have not learned anything. The generalization error is still like, you know, at its initial point. And the reason is because the network is still trying to explain this data set by simple functions. It hasn't seen d to the 7 examples yet, okay? So in a sense, this basically tells us what simple means. Simple means basically look at the kernel, look at its eigenfunction decomposition. The top, you try to explain your data with the top guys first. And as you keep seeing more and more samples, you start explaining your data with more and more complicated functions. So this eigenfunction decomposition gives you an ordering and also a measure of complexity. Okay, so I hope this was clear. So this was, again, analytically solvable limit. So this is the neural network version of it, basically just the same conclusion. I'll skip that, but you can make a general statement, not just in this analytical solvable model, but a more general statement about this, and which is the following. You can take your generalization error and decompose it into different modes. Because our loss is squared, this happens. So you can define a square loss in the first mode, in the second mode, and third mode, and fourth mode, and you will find that basically the error in the first mode is going to fall in a percent manner faster than the second mode, and the third mode, and the fourth mode. So basically, yeah, there will be some kind of bias towards simple functions. So I just saw the question. So Tim Havel is asking, one more thing, there would be some dependence on depth even in the infinite width limit. I had the initial impression it was all two layer, but I just saw three. So this is general. Yes, there's a dependence on depth. So this is not a two-layer network I'm talking about. This is for any layer. I mean, any layer neural network can be, there's a kernel for it. So you need to diagonalize it and get its eigenvalues. And there is a dependence on depth. So let me go back. And I will actually, let me continue because I will make exactly a point about this in a few slides, and I'll make the connection there. Okay, but what will change as you change the depth is these eigenvalues are going to change, and that is going to also affect how these biases are. If the eigenvalue gap is high, you expect the bias to be more stronger, basically. Okay, so but actually this is what I'm going to make the point. So let's take all of these lessons into this problem. Okay, so can we say something intuitive about this particular problem? Suppose I give a neural network this simple task. You want to tell in this m-less digits data set zeros from ones versus eights from nines. Okay, this is just a task. I'm going to give a bunch of zeros. I'm going to give a bunch of ones. I'm going to make the network tell them apart, or eights versus nines. Okay, so which one is easier or which one is harder for this neural network? Okay, that's a question. I can ask this question to you. I don't know, like which one do you think will require more samples to come to some equal, let's say, performance?
think the 891 one will be harder.
891 will be harder because it has these curved, maybe common, right? It looks more like a 9 than 0 looks more like a 1, certainly. So these are, yeah, exactly. Everyone is agreeing with this. These are our intuitions, and yes, it's going to turn out to be true. But why is it? So this is true for us, but why is it true for the neural network? Can we understand this from everything I've said? Okay. Yeah. So point 1, yes, it is true. So basically, the error decreases. It's a 3-layer neural network, fully connected, much faster for the 0-1 case than the 8-9 case. Okay, so can we understand why this is so? So we can do this by basically with a kernel PCA, or another way to say it, visualization. So I just told you that, I mean, these neural networks start fitting by explaining the data by lower, eigenfunctions that have higher eigenvalues. So what I can do is I can plot this data 0 versus 1 and 8 and 9 in the space that is spanned by the two first eigenfunctions. Okay, so each point here is 1 digit. This axis corresponds to the value of that digit passed through this first eigenfunction, and y-axis is the value of the digit passed through the second eigenfunction. Okay, so if you look at this dichotomy, 0 versus 1, in this space, remember, the network is trying to use these eigenfunctions to tell them apart first. 0 versus 1 is already almost very well separated. So color code here refers to 0 or 1. Okay, and in the same space, right, 8 versus 9 are not, that well separated. So therefore, if you're relying on these two eigenfunctions, it's understandable that basically you're going to make less errors by telling 0 and 1 apart. Okay, so we can make this a bit more precise. So we can plot a cumulative power. So this is basically the, so now I'm going to look at the target function, okay? The function that takes this image to a label, let's say 0, and this image to a label 1, okay? So that function is going to have an expansion in the eigenfunctions of the kernel that is defined by the neural network. And I can plot the cumulative power, the power of these coefficients, or the square of these coefficients, up until a point k. Okay, so basically, so k here says all the coefficients squared up until that point. And what you see is that this cumulative power rises very sharply, for this guy, versus not so sharply for that guy. So basically, what the conclusion here is, for this particular neural network, this one is easier than the other one because the function that we're trying to fit, can be explained by the principal eigenfunctions more efficiently and more easily, and these are the functions that I'm relying to do my estimates on with small number of units. Okay, so some more questions. Anirvan is saying the hope is that the kernel is roughly the same for random start points. Yeah. So Anirvan, I think you're asking what if I initialize the neural network?
No, there was a question before.
Okay.
Someone asked a question before the depth network, asking how does it depend on theta naught?
Okay, so I'm working in the infinite width limit. All this theory works in the infinite width limit. So in that, initialization is basically the variance due to initialization is 0. However, for finite neural networks, so these are examples from neural networks with 10,000 or 500. So in numerics, and this is one with 800. So in numerics, for these numbers, the kernel theory, which is in theory works in the infinite width limit, in practice does give reasonable results. Okay, so the other question is, universal approximation theorem says that any reasonable function approximated by a single layer neural network correct. Yes, this is true. Although I'm not sure I see the relevance here. So if you could elaborate, I can say more. Another question, can I say more about what would make certain functions would have high eigenvalues in these cases? Certain functions have, higher eigenvalues. So eigenvalues refers to the kernel. So perhaps you're asking what would make certain functions have higher coefficients in these cases. Okay, certainly. So for example, for this NTK, I mean, so these functions turn out to be complex, right? So you can define so basically all I can say is this. So AK here is basically, so you can reach AK by multiplying your function with phi kx and averaging over the data distribution. So if that value is high, you know, then that particular AK is going to be high. Okay. For spherically symmetric data distribution, a high AK mean, you know, function with, you know, low angular, let's say, a variation. That will be the case. Okay. So I will say, okay, so this was all data when there's no noise. And so I can also introduce some noise to data. And let's see how much time I have. Okay, I'll conclude very soon. And then basically more things happen. It turns out you can get like learning curves that are not monotonic. Adding more data might actually hurt. So we have a full analysis of this for certain cases and related to some phase transitions in physics and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into this. For people who are interested, the paper is out there. So we actually have phase diagrams telling you, depending on regularization and noise, and when you get double descent and when you get not. But in the remaining few points, I want to make so I want to finish this discussion about artificial neural networks, but say something about also biological neural networks. And the reason is because this was actually the reason I started working on this problem. Okay, and the particular problem is the following. So we are at a stage in neuroscience that, you know, we are recording from more and more neurons. So here's a recent paper that was recording from doing imaging and simultaneously recording from 20,000 neurons in the primary visual cortex of mice. Okay, and so this is basically showing you the fluorescence image. This is the portion of the brain that these experimentalist colleagues were recording from. And this is actually the image that this animal was seeing. These are grating. Sometimes they are static, sometimes they are moving. And basically, it is a problem to understand why this particular neurons light up fire, but not other ones. Why this particular pattern of firing? What is the role of these representations? What are they representing? Okay. And one way to sort of describe this representational space is the following. So you can also take these, so you can take these responses and make them into vectors. So this R vector refers to neural response vector. Each element here is a different neuron, so I make it a big vector. And theta 1 refers to a particular orientation of this grating. So I can define the so-called representational similarity matrix. So this is a matrix. Each element here tells me the dot product of this neural representations, or how similar, so that's a measure of similarity, how similar they are or how dissimilar they are as a function of, let's say, pairs of stimuli. Okay. So why am I showing you this? This representational similarity matrix is going to be related to the kernel in a second. But I mean, the broader point I'm making is there are representations, and these representations can be described by this representational similarity matrix. Okay, now, but neuroscientists have long been asking this question. So what purpose do these representations serve? And there is a lot of work in this. And there's just too many references, and it's hard for me to list. So I chose the two that sort of influenced me most. And so a very prominent idea in this domain, especially in the context of early sensory areas, is this idea of efficient information coding. The idea that these representations should be coding for efficiently, in terms of some information theoretic sense, what the stimulus was. Okay, so if you follow the logic of these kinds of arguments, they do actually make a prediction. They do actually make a prediction about the this representational similarity matrix, which I will tell you in a second is actually the same thing as the kernel. Okay, and their eigenvalues. And that prediction is basically a sort of a white code, meaning that, you know, there is like some kind of equalization of eigenvalues. That's what they should look like. Okay. But on the other hand, the recent advances actually allowed us to record from many neurons simultaneously for data sets for images that basically are representative of natural scenes. And what experimentalists found was basically that is not true. What you actually see is not a flat covariance or kernel eigenvalue spectrum or representational similarity matrix spectrum. But what you see is basically one that decays like a power law like this. And I saw the question. I will answer it after I finish my talk. Thank you for it. Okay, so that raises the question, well, maybe the neural code is not, doing efficient information coding, but it's doing something else. So we could actually ask, with all this machinery, is it doing sample efficient learning? So now I'm not going to, this is work in progress. I'm not going to answer this question yes or no, but I will follow its consequences, right? Suppose it was doing sample efficient learning. Suppose we take these kernels and ask the question, right? Or representational similarity matrix, and ask the question, suppose there was a downstream neuron trying to read out something from this population, or basically fit a function. This function might serve another purpose. What kind of functions it could serve well, or fit well, or not fit well. So in this case, I'm going to think about everything up to this primary visual cortex, let's say fixed, and I will only think about training the readout, let's say layer. And in this case, the neural tangent kernel is basically be exactly given by this formula. So it's exactly going to be this representational similarity matrix that we can experimentally actually measure. Okay, so let's take this and calculate its eigenfunctions. So one thing we do is basically turn this into a translation invariant kind of a version. So we ignore the fine level dependence here and plot it as a function of just theta, the theta 1 minus theta 2. We can calculate its eigenvalues and we can calculate its eigenfunctions. And so these are all shifted just for visualization purposes. And what you'd find is basically this looks like very much like Fourier analyzer. Again, the data set here is just orientation gratings, and it's a circular data set. So it's perhaps not very surprising, but it's also nice to know that there is some Fourier kind of a representation here. And then you can also ask with this kind of a thing, what kind of readouts are easy to read out and what kind of readouts are hard to read out. Sorry, functions are hard to read out. And and low frequency functions are easy, high frequency functions are harder. So in terms of sample size. So I will not belabor this point because I made this point with the MNIST multiple times and I'm running out of time. But I will make another point. So this is an interesting point. So if you followed all my discussion, I never made, so my title was about representations. And I never actually talked about representation itself. I talked about the kernel as a way to quantify how similar representations are to each other. Okay, and certainly for all our theory, kernel, but not the particular code itself. So so in this case, r.r, but not k. Sorry, k, but not r itself, is important for learning. So this is a demonstration of fact. So this is a bunch. Each line here is a bunch of neurons. Okay, and their response to a particular angle of that curve that we're seeing. So this goes from 0 to pi, and I could rotate this by rotation matrix. Okay, in this R space, I come up with a different code, but that just preserves the kernel, right? And from a learning point of view, I mean, generalization error just does not change. It's the same with the same number of samples. I do gradient descent training to 0 error. I get the same generalization error. So then you can ask the question, I mean, why choose this code versus that code, right? So why is the brain using one versus the other one? They're all equivalent. Even this question, is a question to be asked. And here's what we found. So there seems to be a subtle difference between those two things, and that becomes apparent when you plot the L1 norm of these codes. Basically, I'm just going to take absolute values of each of these codes and sum them over. And the way I'm going to quantify is the following. I'm going to take the true code. Actually, what we do is, because of numerical issues, we take subsets of these neurons. We have 20,000 neurons. We take, in this particular case, I think 1,000 of them. And then we rotate them randomly, okay? And then calculate the L1 norm for that rotated version. And that gives us a histogram. So this is a histogram over all random rotations of the code. So this is just basically a distribution, in a sense, of all possible codes, you know. So okay, so that code has particular variance and some kind of standard deviation. And this is the true code that the brain uses. And you might imagine how many standard deviations there are here, right? So like a significant difference. So biological codes are sparse, and this is unlikely to happen by chance. And of course, I mean, then you might think of reasons why they should be this case. It might be because sparse codes are more metabolically efficient, because, I mean, you might associate these with total number of sparks that these neurons are producing, and so on and so forth. So that's one reason. This might also have computational advantages. That's work in progress. So I'm not going to give you, but we have ideas. Okay. Just some closing thoughts. Neural networks are biased towards simple functions. In this case, in the NTK limit, simple means composed of the high eigenvalue eigenfunctions of the neural tangent kernel. This might be a satisfactory answer to you or not, but it is an answer. Okay. Inductive bias is a function of the network's architecture, weight, and learning rules. For a wide neural network, all of these are basically factored into the spectrum of the NTK. Okay. Overall, I mean, understanding recordings from large populations of neurons is a theoretical challenge. Function space and kernel point of view might help at least formulate new questions if not answer them. And final point I want to make is the biological codes are sparse, likely due to metabolic efficiency. It would be good if there was also a computational reason why that is true. And with that, I want to finish my talk and thank my collaborators, group members, and also my funding resources. And thank you very much. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions. Maybe I'll start with the question that is on chat. So I guess
well, first, let's give you a thank you. I just want to make sure, pretend like we're in a room and we can thank you. And then, so thank you. That was a great talk. And I guess, yeah, go ahead and start with the couple lingering ones in chat, and then we'll open it up. Yeah.
So I guess my question is with respect to universal approximation theorem. What are the advantages, differences in width, goes to infinite limit between single layer versus multiple layers? Okay. Okay, so this is actually a good question, and it's also a deep question. So the question is also about, if I understand correctly, universal approximation theorem, which basically is talking about the space. So there's a theorem which says if you have a single layer neural network, if you take the width to infinity, you should be able to approximate any function you want. Okay, so that is certainly true. So the question is, well, if you add more and more layers, well, what happens? Well, so you still get a universal approximator, so you can approximate any function you want. But there's a subtle point that comes about what kind of the amount of output, let's say. Okay, let me say this again. So in all of this, we're thinking of sort of a linear regression problem in some feature space. And in that feature space, we have some weights, and those weights have some L2 norm. Okay, and so you might want to put some upper bound on that L2 norm, in the sense that because these weights might correspond to real physical variables, and then you may not be able to, have infinite norm. If you put that bound, then basically the space of functions that you can approximate is going to change. And that depends on the eigenvalues, which is in fact a function of the depth. So I gave a convoluted answer. I know it's easier to talk about this. Just email me, and I can be more help. Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? I'm happy to answer.
Any questions? You can just unmute yourself and ask out loud, or I guess I'll ask one. It's going to be fairly general, and then other people can start thinking of their questions. So I don't even know if this is a well-posed question, but you have this eigenvalue spectrum, right? And you showed very early on the eigenvalues were decaying fast or slow, depending on, I think it was on the depth, something like this. Now, coming from like the realm of dynamical systems and even numerical methods to some degree, I mean, is there some notion of stiffness here and computational, is there some meaning behind, like, the stiffness, the eigenspectrum?
That's a very good question. So so I think the word people will use here is maybe robustness in the following sense. So one way to read these is basically, so suppose you change the input a little, how much the output changes, or how much the code itself changes. Okay. So if you have like if you have an eigenspectrum that is like this, turns out little changes in the input leads to a large change in the code. Okay, so that is in a way not good for learning anything from it, because I mean, you might call this not stiff, or you might call this not robust and not easy to generalize. And but if you go to the other extreme, like for example, this code is falling very, very fast, so then basically the opposite happens. So a lot of your power is in low frequency mode, so therefore little changes in the input does not change the code much, or doesn't have high frequency changes. Therefore, if your goal is to discriminate, fine details, that kind of code is not going to serve your purpose either. So you want to strike a balance in this eigenvalue spectrum that basically, balances these two sort of concerns, right? One, you want your code to be very high dimensional. Maybe you want to be able to discriminate every fine detail and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, that might not be so good because it's not robust. You don't generalize well. It's not noise prone. So you want to strike a balance between those kinds of eigenvalue spectrum. So what I'm trying to say, another way to say it, suppose you have a function that you want to approximate. You want to choose an eigenvalue distribution, basically, which or an architecture, which basically puts all the coefficients of that function in the first few eigenmodes. So that's the idea. So there isn't a clear answer. There isn't a direct answer. It depends on the problem as a whole, the function, the network, all of it together.
Okay, cool. All right. So do we have any last questions before we close shop?
I have a question, if I may, and I apologize that this is some of this is new to me. So, but I want to see if I understand sort of the implication of this for the training of the neural network specifically. So, like, if we know that in this sort of kernel space that it's these sort of this difference in the eigenvalues that really matters for sort of how quickly you can learn, is the analogy here that if you think about the way a neural network is being trained, that actually effectively, as you start, some small set of functions within the network are basically doing almost all of the learning, and
right.
that what's successively happening then is you are moving to sort of like other parts of the network where most of the learning is happening, and that's and so that, and therefore it's the sort of data distribution that determines how fast the data distribution and how well those functions map to it, which is going to determine how fast the neural network is trained.
Right. So I think you have all the right intuitions, but let me just make a few cautionary points just to make sure. So this was all about after I trained. So point one, this was all about after I trained everything to 0 training error, and then I test. Now there's another thing. I think that's what you're referring to. What happens during the training dynamics itself? Okay. So during that too, you can argue, I think, that something similar to this is happening. Basically, so you described this as parts of the neural network. I wasn't sure whether with that you meant like a subset of neurons or something, but I would describe it as a collective behavior of this neural network whose net effect is to start fitting the function, first align, then a sine function, and then maybe second order sine function, or I don't know, twice the frequency or something like this. Yeah. Right. So this was about after training and how many samples do you need after training. But during training too, yeah, there are similar effects people have observed. I'm not sure if there's any theory about this, but certainly people have written about such kind of effects also during training too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, maybe some more questions.
I just have one.
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you can ask your question.
Okay. Hi, Cengiz.
Yeah.
On so when you consider your IKHS, you consider a regularization, right?
Right.
And usually they are L2, which would lead to a code that is not necessarily constrained in L1. So when you do your kernel-based model, and when you look at the distinction between the code and the rotated version, isn't it because you cannot impose an L1 penalty on your kernel model that, I mean, how do you know that the L1 constrained code is actually part of all of those?
Okay, so it's a very good question. And here, there is no training, there is no nothing, okay? This is just the code and its rotated version. So I'm not doing any learning, I'm not regularizing anything, okay? And so these codes and those codes have the same dot products. I'm just going to the code itself and adding all spikes. That's all I'm doing. And all I'm saying is, you know, so if I were to have a distribution over the Haar measure of, I don't know, rotation matrices applied to this code, okay, that will have a histogram like this. Then real code sits basically, you know, I don't know, however many standard deviations away. So this would also be a part of that distribution. It's just a very rare kind of a code. That's all I'm saying. So there is no L1 optimization or there's no L2 optimization. There's nothing like this here. It's just dot products.
All right. What I was thinking is if you use the NTK kernel approach to possibly explain this, I was wondering if network would lead to some.
No, I don't think so, because the NTK approach, I mean, it's all about kernels. It doesn't say anything about the particular code itself. So our current thinking is this might have to do with learning online and learning dynamics itself, as was the previous question was saying. And yeah, but it might be helpful there. But I don't want to say more because I don't understand well either. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just there's a couple of questions in the chat, and then we'll wrap it up.
Go over them.
Yeah.
So, Kanksha is saying, can the outputs get distorted if we go on adding too many layers? Yes, they can get distorted. And so I'm not sure what you mean by this, but you see that eigenvalue spectrum getting flatter and flatter. And that does mean that, yeah, that kind of an effect can happen. So there's a paper by Surya Ganguly and colleagues. It's called exponential expressivity. If you Google these words, they study exactly how these let's say trajectories of data get distorted across many layers if you go deeper and deeper. And it has to do with all these eigenvalues that I'm talking about. So Murat is asking, can we define NTK basis functions as spherical quasi-harmonics in a complex space? So this is a good question. So there are people who try to look at, let's say, data distributions and small deviations from uniform distributions, let's say, and describe them as, let's say, perturbations on spherical harmonics. So that kind of approach is possible, but I think, I mean, for real life data, I'm not sure. I mean, this kind of an approach would give something meaningful. And is saying, was there a recent presentation that focused on the neural biological networks recorded? Could I watch it? So there's going to be a talk in a conference, NeuroMatch, just 1 week from now. I think it's all free. And my student Blake is going to talk about this biological part and more, certainly. My previous presentation, I'm not sure if it was recorded, so I'm sorry about that. Did everything in this talk pertain to a linear network with no activation function? No, actually, no, everything in this talk was about nonlinear neural networks. The linearization I talked about was not about non-activations at all. So it was in the weight space. So no, this is not a linear neural network. It's with the full nonlinearity in the infinite with limits. The training dynamic, the dependence on thetas or the parameters linearizes, but the network is still nonlinear. Yeah.
All right. I think that's great. Thank you, Cengiz. That was a wonderful talk. We can give him another thank you. So I believe this talk will be posted, right, Natasha and Pavlos? So this will be
Yes,
available.
it'll
on
be
the-
up on Monday.
All right, up on Monday. And don't forget, if you guys want to come, we have another talk next Friday. I believe same time, roughly same place. I think it's Zoom. And and have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.